All right, let's dive right into this explainer and completely reframe how we think about 17th century America. The traditional narrative usually starts pretty abruptly, right? Just European ships suddenly arriving on the shores of this untouched, unchanging wilderness. But the historical reality? It is far more dynamic and, frankly, a whole lot more fascinating. So today, we're going to unpack a massive paradigm shift in how we understand this era, exploring what historians now call the Native New World.
So when did the Americas actually start transforming? You'd probably assume the story kicks off with those European ships I just mentioned. But profound transformations, driven by massive environmental and political shifts, were completely reshaping the continent long before any European even made contact. The Americas were already in this state of immense dynamic flux.
It's literally a cosmic domino effect, starting way back in the 13th and 14th centuries. Basically, a slight tilt in the Earth's axis kicked off what we call the Little Ice Age. It cooled the northern hemisphere just enough to cause agricultural productivity to completely plummet. And the result? Absolutely staggering. Massive centralized settlements like Cahokia, which, by the way, at its peak actually rivaled European cities like London in size, were entirely abandoned. Huge Mississippian chiefdoms became politically destabilized, and this triggered mass migrations across North America. Native peoples were seeking better opportunities, often shifting away from centralized rule toward more egalitarian, decentralized communities.
Now, there are a lot of romanticized myths out there about this time. Take the famous 19th century story of the so-called Lady of Cotopaxi presenting a pearl necklace to the Spanish conquistador Hernando de Soto. It completely distorts the reality of indigenous diplomacy. Honestly, it tells us way more about the 19th century American imagination than actual 17th century realities. Because despite the climate chaos we just talked about, powerful paramount chiefdoms like the Cotopaxi in the Carolinas, the Powhatan in Virginia, and the Appalachia in Florida didn't just quietly vanish into thin air. They persisted, and they wielded immense power. In fact, after De Soto invaded and eventually had to retreat, the Cotopaxi continued to rule their region for another century and a half.
But we do have to address a truly devastating reality next, and that is a 30 to 90% population loss. As contact with the Eastern Hemisphere increased, indigenous populations who completely lacked prior exposure and immunity faced catastrophic losses from foreign pathogens, subsequent infections, and famine. And in places with sustained contact, like the Caribbean, colonialism and the brutal enslavement of native peoples made this spread so much worse. Enslaved people were worked to absolute exhaustion, making them highly susceptible to infection, which drove this vicious, terrible cycle of capturing new slaves to replace those who had died, spreading the diseases even further.
When you look at the historical records left behind, like 16th century Aztec accounts of smallpox victims, that staggering 90% mortality rate stops being just a clinical number in a history book. It becomes a stark human reality. It's a sobering reminder of a profound tragedy. These diseases devastated communities and completely altered the social and political fabric of the entire continent.
Now, the popular myth is that there was this single Hollywood-style apocalyptic wave of disease that just swept the continent all at once. But the reality? It was a grinding, cyclical nightmare. Away from sustained European and African contact, pathogens operated quite differently. Various microbes spread locally through native and colonial networks in repeating epidemics. We're talking about strikes every 7 to 10 years for over 2 whole centuries. So instead of one mass event, from 1550 to 1750, it was this relentless wave of new pathogens forcing fundamental social changes over time.
But I really want to pause on this next concept because it is the absolute crux of our entire explainer. Native peoples were not static. Faced with this incredible convergence of climate change and repeating epidemic diseases, indigenous societies didn't just passively fade away into history. No, they responded with profound social, religious, and political change. Scholars today actually refer to this incredible crucible of adaptation as the 17th century transformation, or the Native New World.
They were actively forging a completely new world. Native communities integrated European goods, things like metalwares, firearms, and linens, right into their daily lives, and totally new flora and fauna transformed the landscape. Horses completely revolutionized travel and hunting on the Great Plains. And here's a crazy fact. European peaches adapted so incredibly well that later settlers actually thought they were native to the Americas. As trade for all these goods became vital, competition over resources really intensified. So, to navigate this fiercely competitive, transforming landscape, native communities forged powerful new diplomatic alliances. A lot of present-day native nations were actually formed during this exact crucible of adaptation.
Let's zoom out for a second, because these native adaptations were part of a massive 4-continent collision. This was the Atlantic world.
Think of it as a vast stage connecting Africa, Europe, North America, and South America. From the 14th all the way to the 19th century, this ocean served as the arena where humans collided, prompting historical transformations that created, destroyed, and completely recreated communities. Europeans, Africans, and indigenous Americans were all drastically changing through contact with one another, and with totally new physical environments.
The sheer volume of what we call the Columbian Exchange is just mind-blowing. From the Americas flowed corn, potatoes, tobacco, and tomatoes. And in return, from Europe and Africa came citrus, coffee, livestock like cattle and pigs, those wild peaches we mentioned, and tragically, diseases like smallpox, malaria, and typhus. It was an absolutely unprecedented reshaping of global ecosystems. We're talking sudden extinctions, massive population booms, and human migrations on a scale the world had never seen.
But hey, Atlantic history moves way beyond just physical goods. It was a profound and sometimes incredibly violent collision of ideas. You had people from 4 vastly different continents suddenly forced to navigate totally divergent concepts of what slavery and freedom even meant. They clashed over the very ideas of owning versus occupying land. They heavily debated which religion offered salvation, and they confronted entirely different norms regarding the roles of women in society. Everyone involved had to adapt their economies, their politics, and their core beliefs just to survive in this deeply interconnected new world.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a question. How does this massive collision of ideas continue to shape us today? Because the 17th century wasn't just some distant era of explorers and ancient chieftains. It was the literal crucible of the modern world. The intense debates over freedom, over who controls the land, and how our society is structured, they didn't just end in the 1600s. They're the exact same debates dominating our news feeds right now. So the next time you read a headline about land rights, or honestly, even just bite into a peach, ask yourself, how much of our present reality was written by the collisions of the native New World?